tangled in the trees. And on the last hill but one, they saw the great gulf, white and mystical under the moon, but not yet icebound. "There's just one spot on this road where I always feel suddenly, I'm home," said Anne. "It's the top of the next hill, where we'll see the lights of Green Gables. I'm just thinking of the supper Marilla will have ready for us. I believe I can smell it here. Oh, it's good, good, good to be home again." At Green Gables, every tree in the yard seemed to welcome her back. Every lighted window was beckoning. And how good Marilla's kitchen smelled as they opened the door. There were hugs and exclamations and laughter. Even Catherine seemed somehow no outsider, but one of them. Mrs. Rachel Lynde had set her cherished parlor lamp on the supper table and lighted it. It was really a hideous thing, with a hideous red globe, but what a warm, rosy, becoming light it cast over everything. How warm and friendly were the shadows. How pretty Dora was growing, and Davy really seemed almost a man. There was news to tell. Diana had a small daughter, Josie Pye actually had a young man, and Charlie Sloane was said to be engaged. It was all just as exciting as news of empire could have been. Mrs. Lynde's new patchwork quilt, just completed, containing 5,000 pieces, was on display and received its meed of praise. "When you come home, Anne," said Davy, "everything seems to come alive." "Ah, this is how life should be," purred Dora's kitten. "I've always found it hard to resist the lure of a moonlight night," said Anne after supper. "How about a snowshoe tramp, Miss Brooke? I think that I've heard that you snowshoe."
"Yes, it's the only thing I can do, but I haven't done it for 6 years," said Catherine with a shrug.
Anne rooted out her snowshoes from the garret, and Davy shot over to Orchard Slope to borrow an old pair of Diana's for Catherine. They went through Lover's Lane, full of lovely tree shadows, and across fields, where little fir trees fringed the fences, and through woods which were full of secrets they seemed always on the point of whispering to you but never did, and through open glades that were like pools of silver. They did not talk, or want to talk. It was as if they were afraid to talk for fear of spoiling something beautiful. But Anne had never felt so near Catherine Brooke before. By some magic of its own, the winter night had brought them together. Well, almost together, but not quite. When they came out to the main road, and a sleigh flashed by, bells ringing, laughter tinkling, both girls gave an involuntary sigh. It seemed to both that they were leaving behind a world that had nothing in common with the one to which they were returning, a world where time was not, which was young with immortal youth, where souls communed with each other in some medium that needed nothing so crude as words.
"It's been wonderful,"
said Catherine so obviously to herself that Anne made no response. They went down the road and up the long Green Gables lane, but just before they reached the yard gate, they both paused as by a common impulse and stood in silence, leaning against the old mossy fence, and looked at the brooding, motherly old house, seen dimly through its veil of trees. How beautiful Green Gables was on a winter night. Below it, the lake of shining waters was locked in ice, patterned around its edges with tree shadows. Silence was everywhere, save for the staccato clip of a horse trotting over the bridge. Anne smiled to recall how often she had heard that sound as she lay in her gable room and pretended to herself that it was the gallop of fairy horses passing in the night. Suddenly, another sound broke the stillness. "Catherine, you're not crying." Somehow it seemed impossible to think of Catherine crying, but she was, and her tears suddenly humanized her. Anne no longer felt afraid of her. "Catherine, dear Catherine, what is the matter? Can I help?"
"Oh, you can't understand," gasped Catherine. Things have always been made easy for you. You seem to live in a little enchanted circle of beauty and romance. I wonder what delightful discovery I'll make today. That seems to be your attitude to life, Anne. As for me, I've forgotten how to live. No, I never knew how. I'm like a creature caught in a trap. I could never get out. And it seems to me that somebody is always poking sticks at me through the bars. And you have more happiness than you know what to do with. Friends everywhere, a lover. Not that I want a lover, I hate men, but if I died tonight, not one living soul would miss me. How would you like to be absolutely friendless in the world?
Catherine's voice broke in another sob. Catherine, you say you like frankness. I'm going to be frank. If you are as friendless as you say, it is your own fault. I've wanted to be friends with you, but you've been all prickles and stings.
Oh, I know. How I hated you when you came first, flaunting your circlet of pearls.
Catherine, I didn't flaunt it.
No, I suppose not. That's just my natural hatefulness. But it seemed to flaunt itself. Not that I envied you your beau. I've never wanted to be married. I saw enough of that with father and mother. But I hated your being over me when you were younger than I. I was glad when the Pringles made trouble for you. You seemed to have everything I hadn't. Charm, friendship, youth. Youth. I never had anything but starved youth. You know nothing about it. You don't know. You haven't the least idea of what it is like not to be wanted by anyone. Anyone.
Oh, haven't I? Cried Anne. In a few poignant sentences, she sketched her childhood before coming to Green Gables.
I wish I'd known that,
said Catherine.
It would have made a difference. To me, you seemed one of the favorites of fortune. I've been eating my heart out with envy of you. You got the position I wanted. Oh, I know you're better qualified than I am, but there it was. You're pretty. Well, at least you make people believe you're pretty. My earliest recollection is of someone saying, "What an ugly child." You come into a room delightfully. Oh, I remember how you came into school that first morning. But I think the real reason I've hated you so is that you always seem to have some secret delight, as if every day of life was an adventure. In spite of my hatred, there were times when I acknowledged to myself that you might just have come from some far-off star.
Really, Catherine, you take my breath with all these compliments. But you don't hate me any longer, do you? We can be friends now.
I don't know. I've never had a friend of any kind, much less one of anything like my own age. I don't belong anywhere, never have belonged. I don't think I know how to be a friend. No, I don't hate you any longer. I don't know how I feel about you. Oh, I suppose it's your noted charm beginning to work on me. I only know that I feel I'd like to tell you what my life has been like. I could never have told you if you hadn't told me about your life before you came to Green Gables. I want you to understand what has made me as I am. I don't know why I should want you to understand, but I do.
Tell me, Catherine, dear. I do want to understand you.
You do know what it is like not to be wanted, I admit, but not what it is like to know that your father and mother don't want you. Mine didn't. They hated me from the moment I was born, and before, and they hated each other. Yes, they did. They quarreled continually, just mean, nagging, petty quarrels. My childhood was a nightmare. They died when I was 7, and I went to live with Uncle Henry's family. They didn't want me either. They all looked down on me because I was living on their charity. I remember all the snubs I got. Everyone. I can't remember a single kind word. I had to wear my cousin's cast-off clothes. I remember one hat in particular. It made me look like a mushroom. And they made fun of me whenever I put it on. One day I tore it off and threw it on the fire. I had to wear the most awful old tam to church all the rest of the winter. I never even had a dog, and I wanted one so. I had some brains. I longed so for a BA course, but naturally I might just as well have yearned for the moon. However, Uncle Henry agreed to put me through Queen's if I would pay him back when I got to school. He paid my board in a miserable third-rate boarding house where I had a room over the kitchen that was ice-cold in winter and boiling hot in summer and full of stale cooking smells in all seasons, and the clothes I had to wear to Queen's. But I got my license, and I got the second room in Summerside High, the only bit of luck I've ever had. Ever since then, I've been pinching and scrimping to pay back Uncle Henry. Not only what he'd spent putting me through Queen's, but what my board through all the years I lived there cost him. I was determined I would not owe him 1 cent. That is why I boarded with Mrs. Dennis and dressed shabbily, and I've just finished paying him. For the first time in my life, I feel free. But meanwhile, I've developed the wrong way. I know I'm unsocial. I know I can never think of the right thing to say. I know it's my own fault that I'm always neglected and overlooked at social functions. I know I've made being disagreeable into a fine art. I know I'm sarcastic. I know I'm regarded as a tyrant by my pupils. I know they hate me. Do you think it doesn't hurt me to know it? They always look afraid of me. I hate people who look as if they were afraid of me. Oh, Anne, hate's got to be a disease with me. I do want to be like other people, and I never can now. That is what makes me so bitter.
Oh, but you can. Anne put her arm around Catherine. You can put hate out of your mind, cure yourself of it. Life is only beginning for you now, since at last you're quite free and independent, and you never know what may be around the next bend in the road.
I've heard you say that before. I've laughed at your bend in the road. But the trouble is there aren't any bends in my road. I can see it stretching straight out before me to the skyline. Endless monotony. Oh, does life ever frighten you, Anne, with its blankness, its swarms of cold, uninteresting people? No, of course it doesn't. You don't have to go on teaching all the rest of your life. And you seem to find everybody interesting, even that little round red being you call Rebecca Dew. Truth is, I hate teaching, and there's nothing else I can do. The school teacher is simply a slave of time. Oh, I know you like it, and I don't see how you can. Anne, I want to travel. It's the one thing I've always longed for. I remember the one and only picture that hung on the wall of my attic room at Uncle Henry's, a faded old print that had been discarded from the other rooms with scorn. There was a picture of palms around a spring in the desert, with a string of camels marching away in the distance. It literally fascinated me. I've always wanted to go and find it. I want to see the Southern Cross and the Taj Mahal and the Pillars of Karnak. I want to know, not just believe that the world is round. And I can never do it on a teacher's salary. I'll just have to go on forever prating of King Henry VIII's wives and the inexhaustible resources of the Dominion.
Anne laughed. It was safe to laugh now, for the bitterness had gone out of Catherine's voice. It sounded merely rueful and impatient. Anyhow, we're going to be friends, and we're going to have a jolly 10 days here to begin our friendship. I've always wanted to be friends with you, Catherine, spelled with a K. I've always felt that underneath all your prickles was something that would make you worthwhile as a friend.
So that is what you've really thought of me. I've often wondered. Well, the leopard will have a go at changing its spots, if it's at all possible. Perhaps it is. I can believe almost anything at this Green Gables of yours. It's the first place I've ever been in that felt like a home. I should be more like other people, if it isn't too late. I'll even practice a sunny smile for that Gilbert of yours when he arrives tomorrow night. Of course, I've forgotten how to talk to young men. If I ever knew, he'll just think me an old maid gooseberry. I wonder if when I go to bed tonight I'll feel furious with myself for pulling off my mask and letting you see into my shivering soul like this.
No, you won't. You'll think I'm glad she's found out I'm human. We're going to snuggle down among the warm, fluffy blankets, probably with 2 hot water bottles, for likely Marilla and Mrs. Lynde will each put one in for us for fear the other has forgotten it. And you'll feel deliciously sleepy after this walk in the frosty moonshine. And the first thing you know, it will be morning, and you'll feel as if you were the first person to discover that the sky is blue. And you'll grow learned in lore of plum puddings because you're going to help me make one for Tuesday. A great big plummy one. Anne was amazed at Catherine's good looks when they went in. Her complexion was radiant after her long walk in the keen air, and color made all the difference in the world to her. Why, Catherine would be handsome if she wore the right kind of hats and dresses, reflected Anne, trying to imagine Catherine with a certain dark, richly red velvet hat that she had seen in a Summerside shop, on her black hair and pulled over her amber eyes. I've simply got to see what can be done about it. Chapter 23. Saturday and Monday were full of gay doings at Green Gables. The plum pudding was concocted and the Christmas tree brought home. Catherine and Anne and Davy and Dora went to the woods for it, a beautiful little fir, to whose cutting down Anne was only reconciled by the fact that it was in a little clearing of Mr. Harrison's, which was going to be stumped and plowed in the spring anyhow. They wandered about, gathering creeping spruce and ground pine for wreaths, even some ferns that kept green in a certain deep hollow of the woods all winter, until day smiled back at night over white-bosomed hills, and they came back to Green Gables in triumph, to meet a tall young man with hazel eyes and the beginnings of a mustache, which made him look so much older and maturer that Anne had one awful moment of wondering if it were really Gilbert or a stranger. Catherine, with a little smile that tried to be sarcastic but couldn't quite succeed, left them in the parlor and played games with the twins in the kitchen all the evening. To her amazement, she found she was enjoying it. And what fun it was to go down cellar with Davy and find that there were really such things as sweet apples still left in the world. Catherine had never been in a country cellar before, and had no idea what a delightful, spooky, shadowy place it could be by candlelight. Life already seemed warmer. For the first time it came home to Catherine that life might be beautiful, even for her. Davy made enough noise to wake the 7 sleepers at an unearthly hour Christmas morning, ringing an old cowbell up and down the stairs. Marilla was horrified at his doing such a thing when there was a guest in the house, but Catherine came down laughing. Somehow an odd camaraderie had sprung up between her and Davy. She told Anne candidly that she had no use for the impeccable Dora, but that Davy was somehow tarred with her own brush. They opened the parlor and distributed the gifts before breakfast because the twins, even Dora, couldn't have eaten anything if they hadn't. Catherine, who had not expected anything except perhaps a duty gift from Anne, found herself getting presents from everyone. A gay crocheted afghan from Mrs. Lynde, a sachet of orris root from Dora, a paper knife from Davy, a basketful of tiny jars of jam and jelly from Marilla, even a little bronze chessy cat for a paperweight from Gilbert. And, tied under the tree, curled up on a bit of warm and woolly blanket, a dear little brown-eyed puppy with alert silken ears and an ingratiating tail. A card tied to his neck bore the legend, "From Anne, who dares, after all, to wish you a Merry Christmas." Catherine gathered his wriggling little body up in her arms and spoke shakily. "Anne, he's a darling, but Mrs. Dennis won't let me keep him. I asked her if I might get a dog, and she refused." "I've arranged it all with Mrs. Dennis. You'll find she won't object. And anyway, Catherine, you're not going to be there long. You must find a decent place to live now that you've paid off what you thought were your obligations. Look at the lovely box of stationery Diana sent me. Isn't it fascinating to look at the blank pages and wonder what will be written on them?" Mrs. Lynde was thankful it was a white Christmas. There would be no fat graveyards when Christmas was white. But to Catherine it seemed a purple and crimson and golden Christmas, and the week that followed was just as beautiful. Catherine had often wondered bitterly just what it would be like to be happy, and now she found out. She bloomed out in the most astonishing way. Anne found herself enjoying their companionship. "To think I was afraid she would spoil my Christmas holidays," she reflected in amazement.
"To think," Catherine said to herself, "that I was on the verge of refusing to come here when Anne invited me."
They went for long walks, through Lover's Lane and the haunted wood, where the very silence seemed friendly, over hills where the light snow whirled in a winter dance of goblins, through old orchards full of violet shadows, through the glory of sunset woods. There were no birds to chirp or sing, no brooks to gurgle, no squirrels to gossip, but the wind made occasional music that had in quality what it lacked in quantity. "One can always find something lovely to look at or listen to," said Anne. They talked of cabbages and kings, and hitched their wagons to stars, and came home with appetites that taxed even the Green Gables pantry. One day it stormed and they couldn't go out. The east wind was beating around the eaves, and the gray gulf was roaring. But even a storm at Green Gables had charms of its own. It was cozy to sit by the stove and dreamily watch the firelight flickering over the ceiling while you munched apples and candy. How jolly supper was with the storm wailing outside. One night Gilbert took them to see Diana and her new baby daughter.
"I never held a baby in my life before," said Catherine as they drove home. "For one thing I didn't want to, and for another I'd have been afraid of it going to pieces in my grasp. You can't imagine how I felt, so big and clumsy with that tiny, exquisite thing in my arms. I know Mrs. Wright thought I was going to drop it every minute. I could see her striving heroically to conceal her terror. But it did something to me. The baby, I mean. I haven't decided just what."
"Babies are such fascinating creatures," said Anne dreamily. "They are what I heard somebody at Redmond call terrific bundles of potentialities. Think of it, Catherine. Homer must have been a baby once, a baby with dimples and great eyes full of light. He couldn't have been blind then, of course."
"What a pity his mother didn't know he was to be Homer," said Catherine.
"But I'm glad Judas's mother didn't know he was going to be Judas," said Anne softly. "I hope she never did know." There was a concert in the hall one night, with a party at Abner Sloane's after it, and Anne persuaded Catherine to go to both. "I want you to give us a reading for our program, Catherine. I've heard you read beautifully."
"I used to recite. I think I rather liked doing it, but the summer before last I recited at a shore concert, which a party of summer resorters got up, and I heard them laughing at me afterwards."
"How do you know they were laughing at you?"
"They must have been. There wasn't anything else to laugh at."
Anne hid a smile and persisted in asking for the reading. "Give Ginevra for an encore. I'm told you do that splendidly. Mrs. Stephen Pringle told me she never slept a wink the night after she heard you give it."
"No, I've never liked Ginevra. It's in the reading, so I try occasionally to show the class how to read it. I really have no patience with Ginevra. Why didn't she scream when she found herself locked in? When they were hunting everywhere for her, surely somebody would have heard her."
Catherine finally promised the reading, but was dubious about the party.
"I'll go, of course, but nobody will ask me to dance, and I'll feel sarcastic and prejudiced and ashamed. I'm always miserable at parties, the few I've ever gone to. Nobody seems to think I can dance. You know I can fairly well, Anne. I picked it up at Uncle Henry's because a poor bit of a maid they had wanted to learn too, and she and I used to dance together in the kitchen at night to the music that went on in the parlor. I think I'd like it, with the right kind of partner."
"You won't be miserable at this party, Catherine. You won't be outside looking in. There's all the difference in the world, you know, between being inside looking out and outside looking in. You have such lovely hair, Catherine. Do you mind if I try a new way of doing it?" Catherine shrugged.
"Oh, go ahead. I suppose my hair does look dreadful, but I've no time to be always primping. I haven't a party dress. Will my green taffeta do?"
It will have to do, although green is the one color above all others that you should never wear, my Catherine. But you're going to wear a red pin-tucked chiffon collar I've made for you. Yes, you are. You ought to have a red dress, Catherine.
I've always hated red. When I went to live with Uncle Henry, Aunt Gertrude always made me wear aprons of bright turkey red. The other children in school used to call out fire when I came in with one of those aprons on. Anyway, I can't be bothered with clothes.
Heaven grant me patience. Clothes are very important, said Anne severely, as she braided and coiled. Then she looked at her work and saw that it was good. She put her arm about Catherine's shoulders and turned her to the mirror. Don't you truly think we are a pair of quite good-looking girls? She laughed. And isn't it really nice to think people will find some pleasure in looking at us? There are so many homely people who would actually look quite attractive if they took little pains with themselves. 3 Sundays ago in church, you remember the day poor old Mr. Milvan preached and had such a terrible cold in his head that nobody could make out what he was saying? Well, I passed the time making the people around me beautiful. I gave Mrs. Brent a new nose, I waved Mary Addison's hair, and gave Jane Marden's a lemon rinse. I dressed Emma Dill in blue instead of brown. I dressed Charlotte Blair in stripes instead of checks. I removed several moles, and I shaved off Thomas Anderson's long, sandy Piccadilly weepers. You couldn't have known them when I got through with them. And except, perhaps, for Mrs. Brent's nose, they could have done everything I did themselves. Why, Catherine, your eyes are just the color of tea, amber tea. Now, live up to your name this evening. A brook should be sparkling, limpid, merry.
Everything I'm not.
Everything you've been this past week. So you can be it.
That's only the magic of Green Gables. When I go back to Summerside, 12 o'clock will have struck for Cinderella.
You'll take the magic back with you. Look at yourself, looking for once as you ought to look all the time. Catherine gazed at her reflection in the mirror, as if rather doubting her identity.
I do look years younger, she admitted. You were right. Clothes do things for you. Oh, I know I've been looking older than my age. I didn't care. Why should I? Nobody else cared. And I'm not like you, Anne. Apparently you were born knowing how to live, and I don't know anything about it, not even the ABC. I wonder if it's too late to learn. I've been sarcastic so long I don't know if I can be anything else. Sarcasm seemed to me to be the only way I could make any impression on people. And it seems to me, too, that I've always been afraid when I was in the company of other people. Afraid of saying something stupid. Afraid of being laughed at.
Catherine Brooke, look at yourself in that mirror. Carry that picture of yourself with you. Magnificent hair framing your face instead of trying to pull it backward. Eyes sparkling like dark stars. A little flush of excitement on your cheeks. And you won't feel afraid. Come now, we're going to be late, but fortunately all the performers have what I heard Dora referring to as preserved seats. Gilbert drove them to the hall. How like old times it was. Only Catherine was with her in place of Diana. Anne sighed. Diana had so many other interests now. No more running round to concerts and parties for her. But what an evening it was! What silvery satin roads with a pale green sky in the west after a light snowfall. Orion was treading his stately march across the heavens, and hills and fields and woods lay around them in a pearly silence. Catherine's reading captured her audience from the first line, and at the party she could not find dances for all her would-be partners. She suddenly found herself laughing without bitterness. Then home to Green Gables, warming their toes at the sitting-room fire by the light of 2 friendly candles on the mantel, and Mrs. Lynde tiptoeing into their room, late as it was, to ask them if they'd like another blanket, and assure Catherine that her little dog was snug and warm in a basket behind the kitchen stove.
I've got a new outlook on life,
thought Catherine as she drifted off to slumber.
I didn't know there were people like this.
Come again, said Marilla when she left. Marilla never said that to anyone unless she meant it. Of course she's coming again, said Anne. For weekends and for weeks in the summer, we'll build bonfires and hoe in the garden and pick apples and go for the cows and row on the pond and get lost in the woods. I want to show you little Hester Gray's garden, Catherine, and Echo Lodge, and Violet Vale when it's full of violets. Chapter 24. Windy Poplars, January 5th. The street where ghosts should walk. My esteemed friend. That isn't anything Aunt Shatty's grandmother wrote. It is only something she would have written if she'd thought of it. I've made a New Year resolution to write sensible love letters. Do you suppose such a thing is possible? I have left dear Green Gables, but I have returned to dear Windy Poplars. Rebecca Dew had a fire lighted in the tower room for me and a hot water bottle in the bed. I'm so glad I like Windy Poplars. It would be dreadful to live in a place I didn't like, that didn't seem friendly to me, that didn't say, I'm glad you're back. Windy Poplars does. It's a bit old-fashioned and a bit prim, but it likes me. And I was glad to see Aunt Kate and Aunt Shatty and Rebecca Dew again. I can't help seeing their funny sides, but I love them well for all that. Rebecca Dew said such a nice thing to me yesterday.
Spooks Lane has been a different place since you came here, Miss Shirley.
I'm glad you liked Catherine, Gilbert. She was surprisingly nice to you. It's amazing to find how nice she can be when she tries, and I think she is just as much amazed at it herself as anyone else. She had no idea it would be so easy. It's going to make so much difference in school, having a vice you can really work with. She is going to change her boarding house, and I have already persuaded her to get that velvet hat, and have not yet given up hope of persuading her to sing in the choir. Mr. Hamilton's dog came down yesterday and chivied Dusty Miller.
That is a last straw,
said Rebecca Dew, and with her red cheeks redder still, her chubby back shaking with anger, and in such a hurry that she put her hat on hindside before and never knew it, she toddled up the road and gave Mr. Hamilton quite a large piece of her mind. I can just see his foolish, amiable face while he was listening to her.
I do not like that cat, she told me, but he is ours, and no Hamilton dog is going to come here and give him impudence in his own backyard. He only chased your cat in fun, said Jabez Hamilton. The Hamilton ideas of fun are different from the Macomber ideas of fun, or the McLean ideas of fun, or if it comes to that, the Dew ideas of fun, I told him. Tut, tut, you must have had cabbage for dinner, Miss Dew, said he. No, I said, but I could have had. Mrs. Captain Macomber didn't sell all her cabbages last fall and leave her family without any because the price was so good. There are some people, says I, that can't hear anything because of the jingle in their pocket. And I left that to sink in. But what could you expect from a Hamilton? Low scum.
There is a crimson star hanging low over the white Storm King. I wish you were here to watch it with me. If you were, I really think it would be more than a moment of esteem and friendship. January 12th. Little Elizabeth came over 2 nights ago to find out if I could tell her what peculiar kind of terrible animals papal bulls were, and to tell me tearfully that her teacher had asked her to sing at a concert the public school is getting up, but that Mrs. Campbell put her foot down and said no most decidedly. When Elizabeth attempted to plead, Mrs. Campbell said, "Have the goodness not to talk back to me, Elizabeth, if you please." Little Elizabeth wept a few bitter tears in the tower room that night, and said she felt it would make her Lizzie forever. She could never be any of her other names again. "Last week I loved God. This week I don't," she said defiantly. All her class were taking part in the program, and she felt like a leopard. I think the sweet thing meant she felt like a leper, and that was sufficiently dreadful. Darling Elizabeth must not feel like a leper. So I manufactured an errand to the Evergreens next evening. The woman, who might really have lived before the flood, she looked so ancient, gazed at me coldly out of great, gray, expressionless eyes, showed me grimly into the drawing-room, and went to tell Mrs. Campbell that I had asked for her. I don't think there has been any sunshine in that drawing-room since the house was built. There was a piano, but I'm sure it could never have been played on. Stiff chairs covered with silk brocade stood against the wall. All the furniture stood against the wall, except a central marble-topped table, and none of it seemed to be acquainted with the rest. Mrs. Campbell came in. I had never seen her before. She has a fine, sculptured old face that might have been a man's, with black eyes and black, bushy brows under frosty hair. She has not quite eschewed all vain adornment of the body, for she wore large black onyx earrings that reached to her shoulders. She was painfully polite to me, and I was painlessly polite to her. We sat and exchanged civilities about the weather for a few moments, both, as Tacitus remarked a few thousand years ago, with countenances adjusted to the occasion. I told her truthfully that I had come to see if she would lend me the Reverend James Wallace Campbell's memoirs for a short time, because I understood there was a good deal about the early history of Prince County in them, which I wished to make use of in school. Mrs. Campbell thawed quite markedly, and, summoning Elizabeth, told her to go up to her room and bring down the memoirs. Elizabeth's face showed signs of tears, and Mrs. Campbell condescended to explain that it was because little Elizabeth's teacher had sent another note begging that she be allowed to sing at the concert, and that she, Mrs. Campbell, had written a very stinging reply, which little Elizabeth would have to carry to her teacher the next morning. "I do not approve of children of Elizabeth's age singing in public," said Mrs. Campbell. "It tends to make them bold and forward." As if anything could make little Elizabeth bold and forward. "I think perhaps you are wise, Mrs. Campbell," I remarked in my most patronizing tone. "In any event, Mabel Phillips is going to sing, and I am told that her voice is really so wonderful that she will make all the others seem as nothing. No doubt it is much better that Elizabeth should not appear in competition with her." Mrs. Campbell's face was a study. She may be a Campbell outside, but she is Pringle at the core. She said nothing, however, and I knew the psychological moment for stopping. I thanked her for the memoirs and came away. The next evening, when little Elizabeth came to the garden gate for her milk, her pale, flower-like face was literally a star. She told me that Mrs. Campbell had told her she might sing after all, if she were careful not to let herself get puffed up about it. You see, Rebecca Dew had told me that the Phillips and the Campbell clans have always been rivals in the matter of good voices. I gave Elizabeth a bit of a picture for Christmas to hang above her bed, just a light-dappled woodland path leading up a hill to a quaint little house among some trees. Little Elizabeth says she is not so frightened now to go to sleep in the dark, because as soon as she gets into bed, she pretends that she is walking up the path to the house, and that she goes inside, and it is all lighted, and her father is there. Oh, poor darling! I can't help detesting that father of hers. January 19th. There was a dance at Carrie Pringle's last night. Catherine was there in a dark red silk with the new side flounces, and her hair had been done by a hairdresser. Would you believe that people who had known her ever since she came to teach in Summerside actually asked one another who she was when she came into the room? But I think it was less the dress and hair that made the difference than some indefinable change in herself. Always before, when she was out with people, her attitude seemed to be, "These people bore me. I expect I bore them, and I hope I do." But last night, it was as if she had set lighted candles in all the windows of her house of life. I've had a hard time winning Catherine's friendship, but nothing worthwhile is ever easy come by, and I have always felt that her friendship would be worthwhile. Aunt Chatty has been in bed for 2 days with a feverish cold, and thinks she may have the doctor tomorrow in case she is taking pneumonia. So Rebecca Dew, her head tied up in a towel, has been cleaning the house madly all day to get it in perfect order before the doctor's possible visit. Now she is in the kitchen, ironing Aunt Chatty's white cotton nightie with a crochet yoke, so that it will be ready for her to slip over her flannel one. It was spotlessly clean before, but Rebecca Dew thought it was not quite a good color from lying in the bureau drawer. January 28th. January so far has been a month of cold gray days, with an occasional storm whirling across the harbor and filling Spook's Lane with drifts. But last night we had a silver thaw, and today the sun shone. My maple grove was a place of unimaginable splendors. Even the commonplaces had been made lovely. Every bit of wire fencing was a wonder of crystal lace. Rebecca Dew has been poring this evening over one of my magazines containing an article on types of fair women, illustrated by photographs.
"Wouldn't it be lovely, Miss Shirley, if someone could just wave a wand and make everybody beautiful?" she said wistfully. "Just fancy my feelings, Miss Shirley, if I suddenly found myself beautiful. But then," with a sigh, "if we were all beauties, who would do the work?"
Chapter 25. "I'm so tired," sighed Cousin Ernestine Bugle, dropping into her chair at the Windy Poplar supper table. "I'm afraid sometimes to sit down for fear I'll never be able to get up again." Cousin Ernestine, a cousin 3 times removed of the late Captain Macomber, but still, as Aunt Kate used to reflect, much too close, had walked in from Lowvale that afternoon for a visit to Windy Poplars. It cannot be said that either of the widows had welcomed her very heartily, in spite of the sacred ties of family. Cousin Ernestine was not an exhilarating person, being one of those unfortunates who are constantly worrying not only about their own affairs, but everybody else's as well, and will not give themselves or others any rest at all. The very look of her, Rebecca Dew declared, made you feel that life was a vale of tears. Certainly Cousin Ernestine was not beautiful, and it was extremely doubtful if she ever had been. She had a dry, pinched little face, faded pale blue eyes, several badly placed moles, and a whining voice. She wore a rusty black dress and a decrepit neckpiece of Hudson seal, which she would not remove even at the table because she was afraid of draughts. Rebecca Dew might have sat at the table with them had she wished, for the widows did not regard Cousin Ernestine as any particular company, but Rebecca always declared she couldn't savor her victuals in that old killjoy society. She preferred to eat her morsel in the kitchen, but that did not prevent her from saying her say as she waited on the table.
"Likely it's spring getting into your bones," she remarked unsympathetically.
I only hope it's that, Miss Dew. But I'm afraid I'm like poor Mrs. Oliver Gage. She ate mushrooms last summer, but there must have been a toadstool among 'em, for she's never felt the same since."
"But she can't have been eating mushrooms as early as this," said Aunt Shatty.
"No, but I'm afraid I've ate something else. Don't try to cheer me up, Charlotte. You mean well, but it ain't no use. I've been through too much. Are you sure there ain't a spider in that cream jug, Kate? I'm afraid I saw one when you poured my cup."
"We never have spiders in our cream jugs," said Rebecca Dew ominously, and slammed the kitchen door.
"Maybe it was only a shatter,"
said Cousin Ernestine meekly.
"My eyes ain't what they were. I'm afraid I'll soon be blind. That reminds me, I dropped in to see Martha Mackay this afternoon, and she was feeling feverish and all out in some kind of a rash. "Looks to me as though you had the measles," I told her. "Likely they'll leave you almost blind. Your family all have weak eyes." I thought she ought to be prepared. Her mother isn't well either. The doctor says it's indigestion, but I'm afraid it's a growth. And if you have to have an operation and take chloroform, I told her, I'm afraid you'll never come out of it. Remember, you're a Hillis, and the Hillises all had weak hearts. Your father died of heart failure, you know."
"At 87,
said Rebecca Dew, whisking away a plate. "And you know, 70 is the Bible limit," said Aunt Chatty cheerfully. Cousin Ernestine helped herself to a 3rd teaspoonful of sugar and stirred her tea sadly.
"So King David said, Charlotte, but I'm afraid David wasn't a very nice man in some respects."
Anne caught Aunt Chatty's eye and laughed before she could help herself. Cousin Ernestine looked at her disapprovingly.
I've heard you was a great girl to laugh. Well, I hope it'll last, but I'm afraid it won't. I'm afraid you'll find out all too soon that life's a melancholy business. Ah, well, I was young myself once."
"Was you really?" inquired Rebecca Dew sarcastically, bringing in the muffins.
"Seems to me you must always have been afraid to be young. It takes courage, I can tell you that, Miss Bugle."
"Rebecca Dew has such an odd way of putting things," complained Cousin Ernestine. "Not that I mind her, of course, and it's well to laugh when you can, Miss Shirley, but I'm afraid you're tempting Providence by being so happy. You're awful like our last minister's wife's aunt. She was always laughing, and she died of a paralytic stroke. The third one kills you. I'm afraid our new minister out at Lowvale is inclined to be frivolous. The minute I saw him, I says to Louisy, 'I'm afraid a man with legs like that must be addicted to dancing.' I suppose he's given up since he turned minister, but I'm afraid the strain will come out in his family. He's got a young wife, and they say she's scandalously in love with him. I can't seem to get over the thought of anyone marrying a minister for love. I'm afraid it's awful irreverent. He preaches pretty fair sermons, but I'm afraid from what he said of Elijah the titbit last Sunday that he's far too liberal in his views of the Bible." "I see by the papers that Peter Ellis and Fanny Bugle were married last week," said Aunt Shatty. "Ah, yes. I'm afraid that'll be a case of marrying in haste and repenting at leisure. They've only known each other 3 years. I'm afraid Peter will find out that fine feathers don't always make fine birds. I'm afraid Fanny's very shiftless. She irons her table napkins on the right side, first and only. Not much like her sainted mother. She was a thorough woman if ever there was one. When she was in mourning, she always wore black nightgowns. Said she felt as bad in the night as in the day. I was down at Andy Bugle's helping him with the cooking, and when I come downstairs on the wedding morning, if there wasn't Fanny eating an egg for breakfast, and her getting married that day. I don't suppose you'll believe that. I wouldn't if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. My poor dead sister never had a thing for 3 days afore she was married, and after her husband died we was all afraid she was never going to eat again. There are times when I feel I can't understand the Bugles any longer. There was a time when you knew where you was with your own connection, but it ain't that way now."
"Is it true that Gene Young is going to be married again?" asked Aunt Kate.
"I'm afraid it is. Of course, Fred Young is supposed to be dead, but I'm dreadful afraid he'll turn up yet. You can never trust that man. She's going to marry Ira Roberts. I'm afraid he's only marrying her to make her happy. His Uncle Philip once wanted to marry me, but I says to him, says I, 'Bugle I was born, and bugle I will die. Marriage is a leap in the dark,' says I, and I ain't going to be drug into it. There's been an awful lot of weddings in Lowvale this winter. I'm afraid there'll be funerals all summer to make up for it. Annie Edwards and Chris Hunter were married last month. I'm afraid they won't be as fond of each other in a few years' time as they are now. I'm afraid she was just swept off her feet by his dashing ways. His Uncle Hiram was crazy. He believed he was a dog for years."
"If he did his own barking, nobody need to have grudged him the fun of it,"
said Rebecca Dew, bringing in the pear preserves and the layer cake.
"I never heard that he barked," said Cousin Ernestine. "He just gnawed bones and buried them when nobody was looking. His wife felt it."
"Where is Mrs. Lily Hunter this winter?" asked Aunt Shatty.
"She's been spending it with her son in San Francisco, and I'm awful afraid there'll be another earthquake afore she gets out of it. If she does, she'll likely try to smuggle and have trouble at the border. If it ain't one thing, it's another when you're traveling. But folks seem to be crazy for it. My cousin Jim Bugle spent the winter in Florida. I'm afraid he's getting rich and worldly. I said to him, 'fore he went, says I remember it was the night afore the Coleman's dog died. Or was it? Yes, it was. 'Pride goeth afore destruction, and a haughty spirit afore a fall,' says I. His daughter is teaching over in the Bugle Road School, and she can't make up her mind which of her beaus to take. 'There's one thing I can assure you of, Mariannetta,' says I, 'and that is you'll never get the one you love best. So you better take the one as loves you, if you can be sure he does.' I hope she'll make a better choice than Jessie Chipman did. I'm afraid she's just going to marry Oscar Green because he was always around. "Is that what you picked out?" I says to her. "His brother died of galloping consumption. And don't be married in May," says I, "for May's awful unlucky for a wedding."
"How encouraging you always are," said Rebecca Dew, bringing in a plate of macaroons.
"Can you tell me," said Cousin Ernestine, ignoring Rebecca Dew and taking a second helping of pears, "if a calceolaria is a flower or a disease?"
"A flower," said Aunt Shatty.
Cousin Ernestine looked a little disappointed. "Well, whatever it is, Sandy Bugle's widow's got it. I heard her telling her sister in church last Sunday that she had a calceolaria at last. Your geraniums are dreadful scraggy, Charlotte. I'm afraid you don't fertilize them properly. Mrs. Sandy's gone out of mourning, and poor Sandy only dead 4 years. Ah, well, the dead are soon forgot nowadays. My sister wore crape for her husband 25 years. Did you know your placate was open?" said Rebecca, setting a coconut pie before Aunt Kate. "I haven't time to be always staring at my face in the glass," said Cousin Ernestine acidly. "What if my placate is open? I've got 3 petticoats on, haven't I? They tell me the girls nowadays only wear 1. I'm afraid the world is getting dreadful gay and giddy. I wonder if they ever think of the Judgment Day." "Do you suppose they'll ask us at the Judgment Day how many petticoats we've got on?" asked Rebecca Dew, escaping to the kitchen before anyone could register horror. Even Aunt Shatty thought Rebecca Dew really had gone a little too far. "I suppose you saw old Alex Crowdy's death last week in the paper," sighed Cousin Ernestine. "His wife died 2 years ago, literally harried into her grave, poor creature. They say he's been awful lonely since she died, but I'm afraid that's too good to be true. And I'm afraid they're not through with their troubles with him yet, even if he is buried. I hear he wouldn't make a will, and I'm afraid there'll be awful ructions over the estate. They say Annabel Crowdy is going to marry a jack-of-all-trades. Her mother's first husband was one, so maybe it's hereditary. Annabel's had a hard life of it, but I'm afraid she'll find it's out of the frying pan into the fire, even if it don't turn out he's got a wife already."
"What is Jane Goldwyn doing with herself this winter?" asked Aunt Kate. "She hasn't been in town for a long time."
"Ah, poor Jane. She's just pining away mysteriously. They don't know what's the matter with her, but I'm afraid it'll turn out to be an alibi. What is Rebecca Dew laughing like a hyena's out in the kitchen for? I'm afraid you'll have her on your hands yet. There's an awful lot of weak minds among the Dews."
"I see Thyra Cooper has a baby," said Aunt Shatty.
"Ah, yes, poor little soul. Only one, thank mercy. I was afraid it would be twins. Twins run so in the Coopers."
"Thyra and Ned are such a nice young couple," said Aunt Kate, as if determined to salvage something from the wreck of the universe. But Cousin Ernestine would not admit that there was any balm in Gilead, much less in Lowvale.
"Yeah, she was real thankful to get him at last. There was a time she was afraid he wouldn't come back from the West. I warned her. 'You may be sure he'll disappoint you,' I told her. 'He's always disappointed people. Everyone expected him to die before he was a year old, but you see he's alive yet.' When he bought the Hawley place, I warned her again. 'I'm afraid that place is full of typhoid,' I told her. 'The Hawley hired man died of typhoid there 5 years ago. They can't blame me if anything happens. Joseph Hawley has some misery in his back. He calls it lumbago, but I'm afraid it's the beginning of spinal meningitis.' Old Uncle Joseph Hawley is one of the best men in the world," said Rebecca Dew, bringing in a replenished teapot. "Ah, he's good," said Cousin Ernestine lugubriously. "Too good. I'm afraid his sons will all go to the bad. You see it like that so often. Seems as if an average has to be struck. No, thank you, Kate, I won't have any more tea. Well, maybe a macaroon. They don't lie heavy on the stomach, but I'm afraid I've had far too much. Must be taking French leave, for I'm afraid it'll be dark before I get home. I don't want to get my feet wet. I'm so afraid of ammonia. I've had something traveling from my arm to my lower limbs all winter. Night after night I've lain awake with it. Nobody knows what I've gone through, but I ain't one of the complaining sort. I was determined I'd get up to see you once more, for I may not be here another spring, but you both failed terrible, so you may go for me yet. Ah, well, it's best to go while there's some of your own left to lay you out. Dear me, how the wind is getting up. I'm afraid our barn roof will blow off it if it comes to a gale. We've had so much wind this spring, I'm afraid the climate is changing. Thank you, Miss Shirley, as Anne helped her into her coat. Be careful of yourself. You look awful washed out. I'm afraid people with red hair never have real strong constitutions.
I think my constitution is all right, smiled Anne, handing Cousin Ernestine an indescribable bit of millinery with a stringy ostrich feather dripping from its back. I have a touch of sore throat tonight, Miss Bugle, that's all.
Ah,
another of Cousin Ernestine's dark forebodings came to her.
You want to watch a sore throat. The symptoms of diphtheria and tonsillitis are exactly the same till the third day. But there's one consolation. You'll be spared an awful lot of trouble if you die young.
Chapter 26. Tower Room, Windy Poplars, April 20th. Poor dear Gilbert. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I'm afraid I'll turn gray young. I'm afraid I'll end up in the poorhouse. I'm afraid none of my pupils will pass their finals. Mr. Hamilton's dog barked at me Saturday night, and I'm afraid I'll have hydrophobia. I'm afraid my umbrella will turn inside out when I keep a tryst with Catherine tonight. I'm afraid Catherine likes me so much now that she can't always like me as much. I'm afraid my hair isn't auburn after all. I'm afraid I'll have a mole on the end of my nose when I'm 50. I'm afraid my school is a fire trap. I'm afraid I'll find a mouse in my bed tonight. I'm afraid you got engaged to me just because I was always around. I'm afraid I'll soon be picking at the counterpane. No, dearest, I'm not crazy. Not yet. It is only that Cousin Ernestine Bugle is catching. I know now why Rebecca Dew has always called her Miss Much Afraid. The poor soul has borrowed so much trouble, she must be hopelessly in debt to fate. There are so many Bugles in the world, not many quite so far gone in buglism as Cousin Ernestine, perhaps, but so many killjoys, afraid to enjoy today because of what tomorrow will bring. Gilbert, darling, don't let's ever be afraid of things. It's such dreadful slavery. Let's be daring and adventurous and expectant. Let's dance to meet life and all it can bring to us, even if it brings scads of trouble and typhoid and twins. Today has been a day dropped out of June into April. The snow is all gone, and the fawn meadows and golden hills just sing of spring. I know I heard Pan piping in the little green hollow in my maple bush, and my storm king was bannered with the airiest of purple hazes. We've had a great deal of rain lately, and I've loved sitting in my tower in the still, wet hours of the spring twilights. But tonight is a gusty, hurrying night. Even the clouds racing over the sky are in a hurry, and the moonlight that gushes out between them is in a hurry to flood the world. Suppose, Gilbert, we were walking hand in hand down one of the long roads in Avonlea tonight. Gilbert, I'm afraid I'm scandalously in love with you. You don't think it's irreverent, do you? But then, you're not a minister. Chapter 27. I'm so different, sighed Hazel. It was really dreadful to be so different from other people, and yet rather wonderful, too, if you were a being strayed from another star. Hazel would not have been one of the common herd for anything, no matter what she suffered by reason of her differentness. Everybody is different, said Anne amusedly. You were smiling. Hazel clasped a pair of very white, very dimpled hands and gazed adoringly at Anne. She emphasized at least one syllable in every word she uttered. You have such a fascinating smile, such a haunting smile. I knew the moment I first saw you that you would understand everything. We are on the same plane. Sometimes I think I must be psychic, Miss Shirley. I always know so instinctively the moment I meet anyone whether I'm going to like them or not. I felt at once that you were sympathetic, that you would understand. It's so sweet to be understood. Nobody understands me, Miss Shirley. Nobody. But when I saw you, some inner voice whispered to me, She will understand. With her you can be your real self. Oh, Miss Shirley, let's be real. Let's always be real. Oh, Miss Shirley, do you love me the leastest, tiniest bit?
I think you're a dear, said Anne.